The air in the great hall of the silver throne was thick with the scent of power, old stone, and nervous ambition. It clung to the velvet draperies and settled in the lungs of the hundreds of wolves gathered, each one hoping for a glance, a word, a sign from the Alpha King. For Iris Lockwood, it was suffocating. She stood beside her Alpha from the Blackwood Glade pack, a small figure lost in the sea of imposing warriors and she-wolves draped in silks. Her own dress was simple, the deep green of her home territory, and under its long skirt her left leg ached with a familiar, dull throb. She carried herself with quiet poise despite the pain, her warm brown eyes, gentle and observant, scanning the ornate details of the hall. Her fair skin had a delicate dusting of freckles across her nose, creating a striking contrast to the severity of her surroundings. It always did when she was tired or anxious, and today she was both. This was the Great Convergence, the once-a-decade ceremony where the Alpha King, Cassian Thorne, was prophesied to find his fated mate. Every unmated she-wolf from every allied pack was present, a garden of hopefuls waiting to be chosen. Iris was not hopeful. She was here because her Alpha had insisted, a show of fealty to the crown. She knew her place, an Omega and a damaged one at that. Her limp, the result of a childhood fall that had shattered her growth plate, was a visible declaration of her imperfection. In a society that prized strength and physical prowess above all, she was scenery. She kept her eyes down, tracing the patterns in the marble floor, feeling the vibrations of the massive hall through the soles of her slippers. A low hush fell over the assembly, a wave of deference that rolled from the great doors to the throne. He was here. Iris risked a glance upward, her breath catching in her throat. Alpha King Cassian Thorne was everything the legends said. He was impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the burdens of all the packs combined. His black hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of amber, swept over the crowd with an intensity that commanded silence. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his size, his presence an almost physical force that pressed down on the room, demanding submission. Every wolf, including her own dormant, quiet one, bowed its head internally. Then, his gaze snagged on her section of the crowd. His eyes passed over her Alpha, over the other she-wolves from her pack, and then they landed on her. For a split second, the world fell away. A jolt, hot and electric, shot through Iris's veins. It was like lightning striking the base of her spine, and a scent she had never known but had always craved filled her senses. Ozone after a storm, ancient pines, and something fiercely, uniquely male. Her own timid wolf, a creature she rarely felt, stirred from its long slumber, lifting its head and letting out a silent, yearning cry. Mate. The word was not a thought, but a feeling, a deep, cellular recognition that resonated in her very bones. His eyes widened, the amber flaring into brilliant, molten gold. She saw the shock on his face, the raw animal recognition. He had felt it too. The bond, the sacred thread woven by the moon goddess herself, snapped taut between them. Hope, a fragile, foolish thing, unfurled in her chest. For one dizzying second, she forgot her limp, her rank, her place. She was his. He was hers. Fate had decreed it. Cassian started to move, taking a single step toward her. The crowd parted before him like a tide receding from the moon, and then his eyes, those golden, mesmerizing eyes, dropped. They traced her form from her face down to the hem of her gown, and she knew, with a sickening lurch of her stomach, what he was looking for. He was an Alpha King. He would sense any weakness. His gaze stopped at her feet. She was standing with her weight shifted to her right side, a subconscious habit to ease the strain on her left leg. It was a subtle thing, but to a wolf of his power, it must have been as obvious as a gaping wound. He saw it. She knew the exact moment he saw it. The gold in his eyes flickered, cooled, and hardened back into a remote, calculating amber. The warmth of the bond vanished, replaced by an icy chill. He stopped moving. His lips, which had been parted in shock, pressed into a thin, hard line. He looked from her feet back to her face, and the expression he wore was one of profound, regal disappointment. He lifted his chin, his voice ringing through the suddenly dead silent hall, each word a hammer blow against her fragile hope. "She is not fit," he declared, not to her, but to the assembly, to his council, to the world. The Luna Queen must stand strong and whole beside her king. This one limps. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over Iris. He hadn't just rejected her. He had dissected her, found her wanting, and announced her failure to the entire werewolf world. He did not know her name. He did not care to. He had reduced her entire existence to a single damning verb. Limps. Her alpha stepped forward protectively, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Cassian's gaze was granite, daring any challenge. Iris put a hand on her alpha's arm, stopping him. She would not allow her pack to suffer for her shame. She met the king's cold eyes one last time, and in their depths she saw nothing of the man whose scent had promised her a universe. She saw only a king assessing flawed livestock. With as much dignity as she could muster, she turned. Each step was an agony, not just from the ache in her leg, but from the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes on her back. The limp felt more pronounced than ever, a deliberate, mocking rhythm announcing her disgrace to the rhythm of her breaking heart. She did not run. She walked, step by uneven step, out of the great hall, and away from the man who had been her destiny for a single, breathtaking moment, before he had decided she was not enough. The silence in the great hall was absolute, broken only by the soft, uneven tap of Iris Lockwood's retreating footsteps. Cassian watched her go, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. A part of him, the kingly part that had been drilled into him since birth, felt a cold sense of rightness. A Luna Queen could not show weakness. She was the symbol of the pack's vitality, the mother of future alphas. A physical defect was a sign of a weak bloodline, an unacceptable risk for the royal lineage. His council, standing behind the throne, was already nodding in grim approval. He had done his duty. He had protected the future of his people. But his wolf, the ancient, powerful beast that lived under his skin, was not nodding. It was screaming. It was clawing at the inside of his ribs, a frantic, desperate scrabbling that was pure agony. "Mate!" the wolf howled, a soundless cry that vibrated through Cassian's entire being. "Our mate! Go to her! Bring her back!" He ignored it, forcing his body to remain rigid, his face an unreadable mask of authority. The girl, his mate, disappeared through the archway, and the bond, that brilliant, vibrant thread that had sung between them, didn't just break. It tore. The pain was physical, a white-hot agony that lanced through his chest, as if a vital organ had been ripped out. He staggered a half-step, a gasp escaping his lips. He disguised it as a cough, placing a hand over his heart. Under his palm, his skin was icy cold, and a profound emptiness began to bloom where the warmth of the bond had been seconds before. "Your Majesty?" It was Lorcan, his beta and oldest friend, his voice a low murmur at his side. "Are you well?" Cassian couldn't answer. The sense of the hall, once so distinct, had turned to ash in his nose. The only thing he could smell was the ghost of her, wild violets after a rain, and fresh earth. It was fading, and his wolf grew more frantic with every passing second. "Fool," it snarled in his mind. "Arrogant, prideful fool. You have thrown away the other half of your soul for appearances." "The convergence is concluded," Cassian managed to say, his voice strained. He turned away from the crowd, not wanting them to see the tremor in his hands or the sudden pallor of his skin. "Clear the hall." Lorcan gave the order, his own scent laced with deep concern. As the nobles and alphas began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, Cassian retreated to the royal antechamber, the walls feeling as if they were closing in. He ripped at the collar of his tunic, needing to breathe. The coldness was spreading, a creeping numbness that was far more terrifying than the initial pain. It was the absence of her, of the bond. He had known his whole life that to reject a fated mate was to invite a slow death of the soul. But the texts and warnings had been academic. This was a living torment. He paced the chamber, the controlled grace of the king dissolving into the agitated restlessness of the wolf. "You saw her, Lorcan," he bit out, whirling to face his beta. "She was imperfect. The people would never accept a Luna with such a visible flaw. Our enemies would see it as a sign of weakness in my line." Lorcan's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a deep, sorrowful reproach. "I saw a she-wolf who carried herself with quiet dignity, even after you humiliated her in front of the entire continent," he said, his tone even but firm. "I saw the bond ignite between you, Cassian. I have never seen it so strong, so immediate. And I saw you sever it for pride." "It was not pride!" Cassian roared, the sound more wolf than man. The windows of the chamber rattled. "It was duty! My father, his father before him, they all chose strong, perfect Lunas to fortify the bloodline. I am a king before I am a man." "And what of the wolf?" Lorcan countered, unflinching before his king's fury. "Is the wolf not part of you? Is he not screaming at you right now that you have made the gravest mistake of your life? The moon goddess does not make mistakes, Cassian. She chose that girl for you. Her limp, her history, all of it. She chose her." Cassian fell silent, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the gnawing emptiness. Lorcan was right. His wolf was a tormented beast, pacing the cage of his mind, whining with a grief so profound it felt like his own. He could feel its pain as a physical ache behind his eyes, a hollowness in his gut. He sank into a heavy carved chair, burying his face in his hands. The ghost scent of violets and earth was almost gone now, and its absence was a tangible loss. He had felt more alive in the 30 seconds their eyes had been locked than he had in his entire 30 years of life. He had felt whole. Now he was fractured. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words muffled by his hands. "Find out who she is," he commanded, his voice raspy. "Her name, her pack." "Iris Lockwood, of the Blackwood Glade Pack," Lorcan supplied immediately. "They are a small but respected pack from the northern borderlands, known for their resilience and connection to the old forests." Cassian looked up, surprised by the speed of the information. Lorcan's expression was grim. "I thought you might reconsider." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Cassian's lips. "Reconsider? I publicly declared her unfit. I shamed her and her pack. There is no reconsideration. The word of the king is law." "Sometimes," Lorcan said softly, "the law is an ass. And sometimes a king must be man enough to admit he was wrong." Cassian shook his head, the weight of his crown, his duty, his history pressing down on him. "It is too late," he said, the words tasting like poison. But his wolf disagreed. It paced, and through the agony of the torn bond, it whispered a single, defiant promise. "Not yet. It is not over. Find her." The king in him clung to duty, but the wolf had found its mate, and it would not let her go, even if it had to drag the king, kicking and screaming, toward redemption. The cold emptiness in his chest was a constant reminder of what he had thrown away. It was a wound that would not heal. A hollow throne where a queen was supposed to sit, not just beside him, but within his very soul. The journey back to Blackwood Glade was a blur of misery. Iris sat huddled in the corner of the carriage, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though it did nothing to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The pain in her leg was a raging fire, a physical manifestation of her humiliation, but it was nothing compared to the gaping, hollow wound in her chest where the mate bond had been torn away. Her alpha, a kind, gruff man named Phelan, had said nothing since they'd left the capital, but his scent was a constant, low thrum of protective anger. He had wanted to challenge the king. She knew it. But a challenge would have meant ruin for their small border pack, and she could not be the cause of that. She was already the cause of enough shame. When they finally rolled into the familiar clearing of their village, the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and wood smoke was a balm to her frayed nerves. This was home. Here her limp was just a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the wave in her brown hair. It was not a headline. It was not a reason for ruin. Her parents met the carriage, their faces etched with worry. They had heard the news, of course. Bad news traveled on the wind in the werewolf world. Her mother wrapped her in a fierce embrace, murmuring soft comforts, while her father simply laid a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of unwavering support. They did not ask for details. They did not need to. They saw the devastation in her eyes. The days that followed were gray and muted. Iris went through the motions of her life, helping in the kitchens, tending the herb gardens, but the world had lost its color. The bond, even in its brief, fiery existence, had awakened something in her. Now, its absence left everything feeling dull and lifeless. Her wolf, which had sung for a moment, was silent again, curled into a tight, wounded ball in the back of her mind. The emptiness Cassian felt was a mirror of her own, a shared void between two souls that were meant to be one. Sleep offered no escape. She would dream of molten gold eyes and the scent of pine and thunderstorms, only to wake with a gasp to the cold, lonely reality of her room. One afternoon, a week after her return, she found herself standing at the edge of the Whispering River, in a secluded clearing carpeted with moss. This was where she had come as a child after the fall, when the other children had teased her for her clumsy, uneven run. It was where she had learned to be alone. The anger, a slow burning ember beneath the surface of her grief, began to flicker into flame. He had judged her on a single glance. He had weighed her worth in the cadence of her walk. He had dismissed her entire being, her heart, her mind, her spirit, because of a collection of bone and sinew that did not move as he decreed it should. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She was more than her limp. She was more than a flawed vessel for royal heirs. A sudden defiant energy surged through her. She wanted to scream, to howl, to smash something. Instead, she took a step, and another. The clearing was her sanctuary. The rustling leaves were her audience. She lifted her arms, closed her eyes, and let the pain flow through her. She began to move. At first, it was clumsy, a jerky expression of her rage and sorrow. She stumbled, her left leg protesting, the limp and awkward, jarring note in her movement. But she didn't stop. She pushed through the pain, through the memory of his cold, dismissive eyes. She let the rhythm of her own broken heart become her music. She stopped fighting the limp. She stopped trying to hide it or compensate for it. Instead, she leaned into it. She made her weaker left leg the anchor, the pivot point. A moment of stillness. A deep plie on that leg became the coiled spring from which she would launch into a spin, her stronger right leg extending in a powerful, soaring arc. The unevenness of her gait became a unique cadence, a syncopated rhythm that was hers and hers alone. She danced for hours until sweat plastered her hair to her skin and her muscles screamed in protest. She danced until the anger and grief were no longer a poison inside her, but fuel. When she finally collapsed onto the soft moss, breathless and utterly spent, something had shifted. The hollow ache in her chest was still there, a permanent scar, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. She felt the burn in her thighs, the solid ground beneath her back, the cool breeze on her face. She felt strong. From that day on, the clearing became her studio. Every day, she danced. She channeled every ounce of her rejected heart into the movement. She transformed her perceived weakness into a singular, captivating strength. Her dance was not the perfect, symmetrical ballet of the court-trained she-wolves. It was wilder, more elemental. It was the story of a fall and a rise, of brokenness and resilience. It was the story of Iris Lockwood, told not in words, but in the powerful, graceful language of a body that refused to be defined by its imperfections. Her family watched her transformation with quiet awe. The other pack members, who had once offered her pity, now watched her practice with a growing sense of respect. They saw the grace she was forging from her pain. Months passed. The seasons turned. Autumn bled into a harsh winter, which eventually gave way to the tentative green of spring. Iris was no longer the timid, disgraced Omega who had limped away from the Alpha King. She was a dancer. Her spirit, once as quiet as her wolf, was now as fierce and expressive as her art. When Alpha Phelan announced that their pack would be hosting the annual Solstice Festival, a celebration to welcome the longest day of the year, he came to her. "The packs from the entire region will be here," he said, his eyes full of a pride that warmed her to her core. "I want you to dance, Iris. I want them all to see the strength of Blackwood Glade." Fear warred with a fierce, burgeoning pride. To dance in front of strangers? But then she thought of Cassian's declaration. Unfit. A fire lit in her belly. She would show them. She would show them all what a body deemed unfit was capable of. "I will," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will dance." Cassian Thorne, Alpha King of the United Packs, was bored. He sat on a raised dais overlooking the solstice festival of the Blackwood Glade Pack, a polite, kingly mask fixed on his face. For the past 6 months, this boredom, this flat, gray apathy, had been his constant companion. It was the price of rejecting his mate. The emptiness in his chest had become a permanent part of him, a dull ache that never subsided. His wolf was a sullen, resentful creature, silent for weeks at a time, its energy sapped by the severed bond. He was a king running on duty alone, his spirit slowly starving. He had come to this festival as a political courtesy, a show of support for a loyal border pack. He had no desire to be here. The cheerful music, the scent of roasting meats and summer wine, the laughter of mates and families, it all served as a bitter reminder of the warmth and life he had deliberately cast out of his own existence. Lorcan stood beside his chair, a silent, ever-present reproach. His beta never said, "I told you so," but it was there in his eyes every time Cassian flinched at the sight of a happy couple, every time he stared into the distance with a haunted look. Below the dais, the festivities were in full swing. There were contests of strength, merchants selling their wares, children weaving flower crowns. Cassian watched it all with a detached disinterest. Alpha Phelan stepped into the center of the main clearing, calling for quiet. "And now," Phelan announced, his voice booming with pride, "to honor the solstice sun, one of our own will offer a dance. Iris Lockwood." The name struck Cassian like a physical blow. Iris. He had learned it, memorized it, whispered it into the darkness of his empty royal chambers 1,000 times. He straightened in his seat, his apathy evaporating like mist in a harsh sun. His heart, a sluggish and heavy thing for so long, began to hammer against his ribs. He scanned the crowd, searching, but he did not see the shy, wounded girl he remembered. A figure emerged from the edge of the clearing, moving toward the center. She was dressed in a simple, flowing tunic of pale gold that shimmered like sunlight. Her dark hair was unbound, cascading down her back. It was her. But it was not her. The woman who walked into the center of the clearing moved with a self-possession and a quiet confidence that was utterly new. She still had the limp, the slight unevenness to her gait, but she no longer seemed to be hiding it. She carried it as if it were simply a part of her, unremarkable and unquestioned. She reached the center, and for a moment, she stood perfectly still, her head bowed. The festival musicians began to play a haunting, melodic tune on pipes and a single drum. And then, she began to dance. Cassian forgot how to breathe. This was not movement. It was storytelling. It was poetry in motion. Every gesture, every turn, every leap was imbued with a raw, powerful emotion that silenced the entire clearing. He watched, mesmerized, as she used her left leg, the one with the limp, as her foundation. It was her anchor, the point of stillness from which all her power exploded. She would sink into a low, deep bend on that leg, gathering energy, coiling like a serpent, and then erupt into a series of breathtaking spins, her other leg extended, her arms flung wide as if to embrace the sky. She danced of sorrow, her body curving in on itself, her movements slow and heavy with grief. She danced of anger, her steps sharp and percussive, her hands slicing through the air. And then she danced of resilience. She leaped, and for a moment she hung in the air, a perfect, impossible silhouette against the setting sun. She landed with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, the limp not a stumble, but a deliberate, final beat in the rhythm of her triumph. He was so captivated by the dance, by the sheer, unadulterated beauty of it, that it took his wolf's frantic roar to bring him to his senses. "Mate!" the beast screamed, lunging against his mental walls with a force that had been absent for months. "That is ours, that strength, that fire, that is our mate." And with the wolf's cry came the scent. He had forgotten how potent it was. Wild violets and rich, damp earth. It slammed into him, a sensory onslaught that cleared the gray fog from his mind and filled his lungs with life. It was her. The timid girl he had dismissed was this force of nature, this goddess of fire and grace. He saw it all now, with a clarity that was excruciating. The limp was not a weakness. It was the source of her unique power. It was the flaw in the marble that made the statue a masterpiece. It had forged her, shaped her art, given her a story to tell that no perfect, symmetrical dancer could ever hope to match. He had not just rejected a she-wolf with a limp. He had rejected this power, this beauty, this spirit. The music ended. Iris stood in the center of the clearing, chest heaving, her head thrown back, her face luminous with sweat and exertion. The crowd was utterly silent for a heartbeat, stunned. Then they erupted. The applause was thunderous, deafening. But Cassian did not clap. He could only stare, his heart a wild drum in his chest, his soul reeling from the force of his catastrophic mistake. In that moment, he knew Lorcan had been right. He hadn't just been a fool. He had been blind. He had looked at the sun and seen only a blemish, ignoring the life-giving fire that blazed within. The emptiness in his chest was no longer a dull ache. It was a ravenous, howling void, screaming for the part of him he had so arrogantly thrown away. And she was right there. The roar of the crowd was a distant, muffled sound, like waves crashing on a faraway shore. Iris's entire world was contained within the circle of her own breath, the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She had poured everything into the dance, every ounce of pain, every flicker of defiance, every shard of her broken heart. She had danced for herself, to reclaim the body that had been judged and found wanting. As the applause washed over her, a profound sense of peace settled in her soul. She had done it. She had faced the memory of her deepest humiliation and transformed it into a moment of triumph. Slowly, the world came back into focus. She saw her alpha's beaming face, her mother's tears of joy, the awestruck expressions of wolves from neighboring packs. A genuine smile, the first in a long time, touched her lips. And then she felt it. A gaze so intense it was like a physical touch, burning a path through the throng of people. Her smile faltered. Her skin prickled with a sudden awareness, a deep instinctual pull that her body remembered even if her mind wanted to forget. Her own wolf, so long dormant, lifted its head, a low growl of warning and a whine of longing mingling in her subconscious. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found the source. He was on the dais, no longer slouched in boredom, but perched on the edge of his seat like a predator about to spring. Alpha King Cassian Thorne. His kingly mask was gone, shattered. In its place was a look of raw, naked shock, of dawning horror, and of something else. A desperate, agonizing hunger that mirrored the void in her own chest. His amber eyes had flared into that brilliant, molten gold she remembered from the Great Hall, the color of a wolf on the verge of losing control. Their eyes locked across the distance, and the entire world fell away once more. The broken thread of the mate bond, which had lain dormant and frayed between them, suddenly blazed with searing, white-hot energy. It was no longer a gentle hum of recognition, but a violent, demanding pull, a rope yanking her soul toward his. All the pain of his rejection came rushing back, sharp and brutal. But this time, it was different. It was met with the fierce, unyielding strength she had just proven on the festival ground. She was not that broken girl anymore. He had seen her now, not just her face, not just her limp, but the art that had been born from her pain. He saw her now, and now he wanted her. A cold, hard anger settled in her heart. He did not get to do that. He did not get to break her, discard her, and then decide she was worthy only after she had pieced herself back together into something he found entertaining. She held his gaze for a long, charged moment, letting him see the steel in her spine. She saw the moment he decided to act. He stood up, his intention clear. He was coming for her. The crowd began to part before him instinctively. Before he could take a single step down from the dais, Iris broke eye contact. She gave a final, regal nod to her alpha, acknowledging the applause, and then she turned her back on the king. With her head held high, she began to walk away, her uneven gait steady and deliberate. Each step was a statement. You do not own me. Your approval is not my goal. Your desire comes too late. She could feel him following. She didn't have to look. The sheer force of his presence was like a storm at her back. The murmuring crowd fell silent as they watched the unfolding drama, the Alpha King pursuing a lowly Omega who was pointedly walking away from him. He caught up to her at the edge of the woods, his large hand gently but firmly closing around her upper arm. Iris. Her name on his lips was a shock. It was low and rough, thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. She stopped but did not turn to face him. The skin where he touched her burned, a dizzying mix of pleasure and revulsion. Let go of me, Your Majesty, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Please, he rasped. The words sounded foreign coming from him, as if it had been dragged from the deepest part of his soul. She finally turned, her eyes flashing. She looked at his hand on her arm and then up at his face. He looked ravaged. His perfect, kingly composure was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted expression. Good. Let him feel a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on her. Wait for what? She asked, her voice cold as river stone. For another inspection? Will you check my teeth this time? See if my bloodline is pure enough for your magnificent heirs? His face tightened in pain. No, I was wrong. Wrong? She echoed with a bitter laugh. You weren't wrong, Your Majesty. You were clear. Unfit. That was the word you used. A single word to dismiss my entire existence. And you were right. This body, she gestured down at herself, at the leg that gave her the limp he so despised, is unfit for the perfect queen you imagine. But this is the same body that just danced for you. This is the body that created the art you were so captivated by. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. You rejected the body that does this, she said, her words precise and sharp as shards of glass. You don't get to love the performance while hating the performer. You don't get to applaud the art when you despise the artist. They are one and the same. She pulled her arm from his grasp, the strength in her grip surprising him. I am not a curiosity for you to admire from a distance. I am not a broken thing you can decide to want now that I've made myself beautiful in your eyes. I am whole. My limp, my dance, my soul. It is all one. You rejected all of it, so you get none of it. He stood there, utterly speechless, his golden eyes filled with a storm of regret and self-loathing. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. She had spoken the absolute, undeniable truth. With a final dismissive glance, Iris Lockwood turned her back on her king, on her mate, and walked into the deepening shadows of the Blackwood forest, leaving him standing alone with the ruins of his pride. Cassian stood frozen at the edge of the forest, the scent of wild violets and earth fading into the trees. Her words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind. You don't get to love the performance while hating the performer. Each word was a perfectly aimed arrow, and they had all found their mark in the dead center of his soul. He had never, in his entire life, been so thoroughly dismantled. He had faced down rival alphas, negotiated with cunning council elders, and commanded armies, but he had never been so completely defeated as he was by that small she-wolf with her fierce, honest eyes. He was the Alpha King. He could have commanded her to stop. He could have used his alpha authority, a force no Omega could resist. The thought flickered through his mind, a vestige of his old arrogance, and his wolf immediately snarled in disgust. You will not force her, you will not command her, you will earn her. Her rejection of him was absolute, and worse, it was just. He couldn't argue with her logic because it was flawless. He had seen a flaw and discarded the whole. Now that he saw the beauty, he had no right to claim it. He deserved this. He deserved the agony that was clawing its way up his throat, the profound self-hatred that settled like a stone in his gut. Lorcan appeared at his side, his expression unreadable. "Shall we return to the capital, Your Majesty?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Cassian didn't move. He stared into the dark woods where she had disappeared. He could still feel the phantom touch of her arm in his hand, the fire in her gaze. Returning to the capital, to his cold throne and empty chambers, felt like a death sentence. "No," Cassian said, his voice raspy. "Not yet." He had acted on pride and duty before, and it had led him to this ruin. Now, for the first time, he would act on the guidance of his wolf. The beast inside him was no longer screaming or clawing. It was settled, its gaze fixed in the same direction as his, its intent clear and unwavering. Wait. Watch. Learn. Prove. "Your Majesty?" Lorcan prompted, a hint of confusion in his scent. "I am not leaving," Cassian stated, the decision solidifying into unshakable resolve. "Not until she understands." "Understands what, Cassian?" Lorcan asked softly. "That I see her now," he whispered, the words raw with shame and newfound purpose. "All of her." He knew he could not force her forgiveness. He could not buy it with jewels or titles. He had to earn it. And earning it would not be an act of power, but an act of devotion. A quiet, patient, unwavering vigil. He learned from a discreet inquiry by Lorcan that Iris danced every week. Not for an audience, but for herself, at the village's small, informal gatherings. It was a part of their pack's rhythm of life. The following week, Cassian made the journey from the capital back to the edge of the Blackwood Glade territory. He did not come with a royal entourage. He came with only Lorcan, both of them dressed in the simple, practical leather and wool of common travelers. He didn't enter the village. He stood at the tree line, a silent shadow among other shadows, and he watched. The villagers gathered around a bonfire. There was music, storytelling, and laughter. And then, Iris moved into the firelight. She danced again, not the great dramatic performance of the festival, but something softer, more introspective. She moved for the joy of it, for the community, for herself. Cassian's chest ached with a longing so profound it was a physical pain. His wolf sat quiet and content within him, satisfied just to be in her presence, to witness her existence. He did not approach, he did not speak. He just watched until she was done, and then he melted back into the forest and made the long journey home. He did this every week. It became a ritual, a secret pilgrimage. He would handle his kingly duties with a grim, detached efficiency, and then he would ride to stand at the edge of the forest and watch his mate dance. The people of Blackwood Glade noticed. At first, his presence was a source of suspicion. Their alpha, Phelan, confronted him on his third visit, his scent thick with warning. "What is your purpose here, Thorn?" he had growled, using his surname as a deliberate insult. Cassian had met his gaze without challenge, his own alpha presence deliberately suppressed. "I am here to watch," he had said, his voice quiet. "Nothing more. I will not approach her. I will not disturb your pack. You have my word as king." Phelan had studied him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant ruler from the Great Hall, but a haunted man on a penitence journey. He eventually gave a curt nod and left him be. Cassian didn't just watch her body, he began to study her art. He saw the way she used the memory of pain to fuel a turn. He saw how a moment of hesitation in her left leg would be transformed into a dramatic pause that held the audience captive. He started to see the dance not just as beautiful, but as a language. He was learning to understand its vocabulary, its grammar, its deep and complex syntax. He saw her story, and he fell in love not just with the woman, but with the fierce, resilient soul who was telling it. His wolf, which had been a tormentor, became his guide. It no longer raged at him for his mistake, but pushed him forward on this new, quieter path. "See her," it would whisper when his old pride flared. "Remember what you almost lost forever. Patience. Devotion." Months passed. The silent king in the woods became a strange, accepted fixture of the weekly gatherings. Iris was aware of him, of course. She felt his eyes on her, a constant, unwavering weight. It was unnerving, confusing, but it was not threatening. He kept his promise. He never approached. He never spoke. He was simply a witness. Iris felt his presence before she saw him, a deep hum along the frayed edges of the mate bond that was a permanent part of her now. The first time he'd appeared at the tree line during their weekly pack gathering, a jolt of pure panic had shot through her. She'd faltered in her dance, nearly stumbling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected him to stride into the firelight, to make a demand, to exert his power. But he did none of those things. He simply stood there, a tall, dark silhouette against the deeper darkness of the forest, and watched. When her dance was over, he was gone. By the 5th week, it had become a bizarre, unspoken ritual. His presence was a constant, a silent spectator to her most vulnerable form of expression. The other pack members had grown accustomed to it, their initial suspicion giving way to a sort of grudging respect. He never interrupted, never made his presence known beyond his quiet vigil. He was just there, watching. It was the most confusing thing she had ever experienced. This was not the behavior of an arrogant king. Arrogant kings did not spend months making weekly pilgrimages to stand in the cold and watch an omega dance. One evening, a royal courier arrived in the village. It was a quiet affair, a single wolf in the king's livery who asked only for Iris Lockwood. He handed her a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with the royal crest, bowed, and departed without another word. She stared at the seal, her hands trembling slightly. She took it to the privacy of her room, her heart a tangled knot of dread and reluctant curiosity. She expected a royal command, a summons, an apology written by a court scribe full of empty platitudes. She broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment. The handwriting was not the elegant script of a scribe. It was strong, dark, and masculine, the letters slightly slanted as if written with great urgency. It was his. And it was not an apology. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," the letter began, the words stark and direct. "I write only to tell you what I see. Tonight, when you danced, there was a moment you held your arms as if gathering the moonlight. I saw the story of a lonely child in that gesture. But then you spun, and the loneliness became solitude, and the solitude became strength. I had never seen that distinction before." Iris's breath hitched. She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing his words. He wasn't just watching, he was seeing. He was reading the language she had thought was only for herself. She read on. He didn't mention her limp. He didn't mention the rejection. He spoke only of the dance. A week later, another letter arrived. "Your dance tonight was full of fire. It was in the sharp, percussive stamp of your feet, in the way you threw your head back as if in defiance of the heavens. I saw in it the anger of the unheard, the frustration of the misjudged. You did not dance your anger away. You transformed it into something beautiful and formidable. You made anger a creative force." Her carefully constructed walls of cold indifference began to show cracks. He wasn't trying to flatter her or win her over with pretty words. He was analyzing her art with the focused intensity of a scholar. He was giving her the one thing she had never had from anyone outside her family: a true, intellectual, and emotional appreciation of her craft. The letters continued, once a week after every dance. He never asked for a reply. He never suggested a meeting. They were simply observations delivered from his silent vigil. One letter, arriving in the dead of winter, made her weep. "Tonight I finally understood your left leg. I have been a fool. I saw it as an anchor, a pivot, a point of stillness. It is, but it is more than that. It is your truth." Every other dancer strives for perfect, symmetrical grace. They tell stories of fantasy, of flight, of impossible perfection. Your dance is the only one I have ever seen that tells the truth. It tells the story of falling and getting back up. It speaks of the beauty that can only be found in imperfection, the strength that is forged in the place where we are broken. I once called you unfit. I was the one who was unfit to see. What I called a flaw is your signature. It is your warrior's mark, and I was too blind to read it. She clutched the letter to her chest, the stiff parchment softening against the warmth of her skin. A warrior's mark. He had taken the source of her deepest shame and reframed it as a badge of honor. He had looked at the ugliest, most painful part of her history and called it beautiful. The anger she had held onto so tightly began to dissolve, replaced by a bewildering and terrifying tenderness. Her wolf, which had been wary and watchful, began to pace with a restless longing. "He sees," it whispered in her mind. "He finally sees us." She still didn't reply to the letters. She didn't know what to say. But her dance began to change. Before, she had danced for herself, a private conversation. Now she knew she had an audience of one, someone who understood the language. A subtle shift occurred. Her dance became a dialogue. She would pose a question with a gesture, and she would imagine his answer. She would express a complex emotion, knowing he would spend the week dissecting it, understanding it, and reflecting it back to her in his next letter. His patient, silent pursuit was more potent than any command or grand gesture. He wasn't trying to possess her. He was trying to understand her. He was giving her his time, his focus, his entire being, with no expectation of reward. He had rejected her body in a single, brutal moment. But now he was revering her soul, week by painstaking week. And her soul, so long guarded, was beginning to listen. Cassian stood on the frost-kissed flagstones of the western battlement, staring out at the sleeping capital. The moon was a sliver of silver in the ink-black sky. For months, his life had been cleaved in two. There was the king, who sat in council meetings, signed decrees, and maintained the peace of his kingdom with a remote, grim competence. His court whispered that the king had changed since the Great Convergence, that the life had gone out of his eyes. They were right. All the color, all the fire of his existence was reserved for one night a week when he was not a king, but a silent watcher in the woods. His weekly letters to Iris had become the central purpose of his life. He would spend the hours riding back to the capital, replaying her dance in his mind, dissecting every movement, searching for the meaning, the emotion she had woven into it. Then he would lock himself in his study, the rich scent of old parchment and ink filling the air, and he would struggle to translate the profound things he saw in her dance into clumsy words. It was the hardest work he had ever done. It required a vulnerability, an emotional honesty that his life as a king had trained him to suppress. He was not commanding or persuading, he was bearing witness. And in doing so, he was slowly, painfully, rehumanizing himself. His wolf, once his tormentor, was now his quiet companion on this journey. It understood the necessity of this slow, patient courtship. "She is not a prize to be won," it had communicated to him one night as they watched her. "She is a fire to be tended. You cannot rush the dawn." He knew he was making progress, not because she had replied, but because he could see it in her dance. It had become a conversation. She knew he was watching, and she was speaking to him in her silent, graceful language. It was the most intimate connection he had ever had with another being. This dialogue of movement and ink, conducted across miles and silence. But it wasn't enough. Watching her, understanding her, was no longer sufficient. The need to provide for her, to protect her, to build a world worthy of her, began to consume him. He wanted to give her something, not as a bribe, but as a physical manifestation of his adoration, a testament to how he saw her now. An idea began to form. an image of her dancing not in a dusty clearing by a bonfire, but somewhere built for her, somewhere sacred. The next morning he summoned the royal architect. "I want to build a stage," Cassian said, unrolling a blank parchment on the great table in his study. "In the Empress's garden, the secluded one behind the royal library." The architect, a fussy, elderly wolf, looked confused. "A stage, Your Majesty? For theatricals?" "No," Cassian said, his voice firm. "For a single dancer." He began to sketch, his hand moving with a certainty that surprised him. His vision was crystal clear. "It will be circular, open to the sky, no roof. The moon will be its only spotlight. The floor will be made of silver-veined marble, polished until it feels like silk, cool underfoot." He looked up, his golden eyes intense. "It must be perfectly level, flawless. But I want the edge to be unpolished, raw stone, to honor the wildness of its inspiration." He sketched more, his mind filled with the image of Iris. "Surround it with moon-petal flowers. I want their scent to fill the air at night. And I want a single bench, carved from weirwood, placed at a distance. A place for a witness." The architect stared at the drawing, his mouth slightly agape. It was an extravagant, deeply personal project, unlike any royal commission he had ever undertaken. It was not a monument to power, but a shrine. "It will be done, Your Majesty," the architect finally stammered. The construction began immediately. Cassian oversaw every detail with a feverish intensity. He inspected every slab of marble, ensuring the silver veins swirled in just the right patterns. He supervised the transplanting of the rare moon-petal flowers, whose white blossoms only opened in the moonlight and released a scent of night-blooming jasmine and vanilla. His court was bewildered. The king, who had shown no interest in anything beyond his duties for almost a year, was now consumed with the building of this strange, empty stage. Rumors flew. Was it for a new lover? A tribute to a goddess? No one understood. Only Lorcan knew the truth. He stood with Cassian one evening as the last slab of marble was laid. The stage gleamed under the rising moon, a perfect circle of silver and white in the heart of the dark garden. The scent of the moon petals was intoxicating. It was beautiful. And it was heartbreakingly empty. "It is a bold gesture, Cassian," Lorcan said quietly. "What if she never comes?" Cassian ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface of the stage. "Then it will remain empty," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It will stand as a monument to my foolishness. But it will be an honest monument. This stage is the truth of how I see her. It is a space built to worship the art that I once scorned. If she never sets foot on it, it will still serve its purpose. It will be my reminder, my penance." That night, he wrote his weekly letter to Iris. He described her dance as he always did, her movements, the story he saw. But at the end, he added something more. "I have tried to tell you with words what I see when you dance, but my words are clumsy and inadequate. They are the tools of a king, not a poet. So I have built something for you. A place where you do not have to dance on uneven ground in the dirt. It is a stage of marble and moonlight, waiting in a quiet garden. It was built for your art. It was built for you. It asks for nothing. It simply exists, a testament to the beauty I was too blind to see. It will wait for you, whether you come in a day or a lifetime. It is yours." He sealed the letter, his hands steady. He had laid his heart bare, not in a plea, but in an offering. He had built a temple for the goddess he had once cast out. Now, all he could do was wait and see if she would ever come home. The arrival of the king's letter was a familiar ritual, but as Iris took the heavy envelope from the courier, she sensed something different. There was a weight to it that felt more than just the parchment inside. She waited until her family was asleep, the house silent save for the sighing of the wind in the pines outside her window. She sat in her small rocking chair, the moonlight pooling on the floorboards, and broke the wax seal. She read his description of her last dance, his words, as always, unnervingly perceptive. He had seen the flicker of hope she'd allowed herself to feel, and the fear that immediately followed it. He had captured it in his description of a leap that was bold and a landing that was hesitant. Her heart ached with the intimacy of being so thoroughly seen. Then she read the final paragraph. A stage of marble and moonlight, built for her, waiting for her. The letter trembled in her hand. This was not a poem. This was not a pretty abstract compliment. This was stone and earth and labor. This was a grand, breathtaking, terrifying gesture. It was one thing to receive his words, to engage in their silent, long-distance dialogue. The letters were safe. They were ephemeral. She could read them, burn them, hide them away. But a stage was real. It was a physical space in his world, in his home, that he had carved out for her. It wasn't a cage or a pedestal. His letter was clear. It asks for nothing. It was an offering, an empty space for her to fill, or not. The choice was entirely hers. For months, she had been the one in control. She had set the terms of their non-relationship. She had walked away. She had ignored his pursuit. She had held all the power. Now he had offered her a different kind of power, the power to accept. The thought was terrifying. To accept would be to forgive. To accept would be to step back into his world, the world that had so cruelly rejected her. Her wolf, which had been growing stronger and more restless with each letter, was now pacing the confines of her mind with an unbearable yearning. He built us a place, it whispered, its voice a siren song of longing. A place of honor. He sees our strength. He sees our truth. It is time. Go to him. She stood up and walked to her window, staring out at the dark, familiar trees of her home. This forest had healed her. This pack had sheltered her. Could she leave it? Could she risk her heart again? A heart that had only just learned how to beat steadily? She thought of his face, the haunted, desperate look in his eyes at the festival. She thought of his silent, weekly vigil, the sheer, stubborn devotion of it. He had not behaved like a king. He had behaved like a penitent. He had stripped himself of his pride, piece by piece, and laid it at her feet. You rejected the body that does this. You don't get to love the performance while hating the performer. Her own words came back to her. But he had spent a year doing exactly that. He had learned to love the performer by studying the performance. He had learned to revere the body by understanding the art it created. He had earned it. The decision, when it came, was not a lightning strike, but a quiet, slow sunrise. It was a yielding, a letting go of the anger that had been her shield for so long. The next morning, she packed a small bag. She found her alpha, Phelan, supervising the training of the new warriors. He saw her approaching, took one look at the bag in her hand and the resolve on her face, and his expression softened. "You're going," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I have to see." He nodded, a deep pride in his scent. "He has earned the chance to be seen," Phelan said, a surprising show of grace. "But Iris, you remember this. Your worth was never in his seeing it. It was always in you. Don't you ever forget that." He pulled her into a rough, fatherly embrace. "Blackwood Glade is always your home. If he proves to be a fool again, you come back to us." "I will," she promised, her throat tight. The journey to the capital was the reverse of the one she had taken in shame nearly a year ago. This time, she was not a summoned Omega, but a woman acting on her own agency. She did not announce her arrival. She slipped into the sprawling city like a shadow, her simple traveler's clothes drawing no attention. She found the palace, a place of looming, painful memories, and using the instincts of a border dweller, she made her way around the massive stone walls to the gardens. She found the Empress's garden easily. It was secluded, walled off, a secret place. The scent hit her first. Night-blooming jasmine and vanilla, intoxicating and sweet, the moon-petal flowers. She pushed open the small, unlocked gate and stepped inside. And she saw it. It was more beautiful than his words had described. A perfect circle of white marble, veined with silver, glowing softly in the twilight. It was surrounded by a sea of luminous white flowers. It was a piece of the moon, brought down to earth. And standing beside it, his hand resting on the edge as if for balance, was Cassian. He wasn't dressed in his royal finery. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, his hair unbound. He looked less like a king, and more like a man who had been keeping a lonely vigil. He must have sensed her, because he looked up. His golden eyes widened, and all the air seemed to leave his body in a sudden rush. He didn't move towards her. He just stood there, his face a canvas of shock, hope, and overwhelming, heart-stopping relief. She walked slowly toward the stage, her limp feeling neither awkward nor graceful, but simply a part of her. She stopped a few feet from him. The air between them crackled with a year's worth of unspoken words, of silent observation, of shared pain and burgeoning hope. "You came," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "The letters," she started, her own voice barely a whisper. "The stage, it was—" "The only language I had left," he finished for her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Words of command failed me. Words of apology were not enough. This was all I could think of, to show you." He finally took a step toward her, his movements hesitant, as if approaching a wild, easily startled creature. He stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell that scent of pine and thunderstorms that was imprinted on her soul. "I was a fool, Iris," he said, his voice breaking. "A proud, arrogant fool, blinded by duty and fear. I rejected the most precious gift the goddess has ever offered anyone. I don't deserve a second chance, I know that. I ask for nothing. But seeing you here, it is like the sun rising after a lifetime of darkness." She looked from his tormented face to the beautiful empty stage he had built for her. He had not commanded her here. He had built a space for her truth and had simply hoped she would choose to inhabit it. She lifted a trembling hand and laid it against his cheek. He flinched as if struck, then leaned into her touch, a shuddering sigh escaping his lips. His skin was rough with a day's worth of stubble and warm, real. "You were a fool," she agreed softly, her thumb stroking his cheekbone. "But you are not a fool anymore." His eyes closed, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path through her fingers. In that moment, with her hand on his face and the scent of moon petals all around them, the broken bond between them did not just mend. It reforged, stronger and brighter than before, tempered in the fires of regret and forgiveness. The days and weeks that followed were a revelation. Iris had feared that accepting him would mean surrendering the strength she had built, but instead, she found that his world could expand to embrace hers. Cassian sought nothing from her except her authentic self. He did not ask her to become refined or regal. He asked only that she continue to be the fierce, resilient woman who had danced her pain into power. He introduced her to his council with a deliberate assertion of her worth, presenting her not as a prize he had claimed, but as a partner he had chosen. The court whispered, of course. Some nobility questioned how an Omega from a border pack could possibly be worthy of a Luna's crown. Whispers of her limp circulated among the high lords, echoes of Cassian's original rejection. But each time doubt crept in, Cassian would find her, and they would walk the palace gardens together, her limp and his steady gait a perfect balance. She would speak her truth, and he would listen with the same reverent attention he had given to her dances. Slowly, the court began to see what he saw. They saw a queen who had been forged in fire, who bore her scars not as shameful marks, but as badges of her survival and strength. They saw a king who was no longer burdened by the crushing weight of perfection, but lightened by love. The whispers changed. They became stories of a king who had humbled himself, of an Omega who had refused to be diminished. Those stories became legend. In the months before the mating ceremony, Cassian built more than just the stage. He built a world where Iris could thrive. He ensured that the palace kitchens honored the recipes of her home pack. He created a position for her alpha, Phelan, in the royal guard, a gesture of respect that made clear she was not a captured prize, but a chosen partner with roots that mattered. And Iris, in turn, gave him something he had lost the moment he'd rejected her: his humanity. She did not let him retreat into the armor of kingship. She challenged him, questioned him, and called him to account when his old arrogance threatened to resurface. She danced for him in the gardens when the burden of rule grew too heavy, and in her movements, he found the reminder that he had chosen love over duty, and it had made him a better king. The day of the mating ceremony was bright and clear. The great hall, the site of Iris's deepest humiliation, had been transformed. Gone were the heavy, somber velvets, replaced with garlands of white moon petals and silver ribbons that shimmered in the light streaming through the high, arched windows. The entire kingdom was in attendance, from the highest-ranking alphas to the common pack members, all of them buzzing with curiosity about the Omega, from a small border pack who had captured their king's heart after so publicly refusing him. Iris stood in the antechamber, not in a traditional white gown, but in the same simple pale gold tunic she had worn at the solstice festival. It was her armor. It was her truth. Her family was with her father's hand a steady presence on her shoulder, her mother fussing with a stray strand of her hair, her eyes shining with pride. Alpha Phelan stood by the door, a silent, formidable guard. Cassian had offered her anything, gowns spun from moonlight, jewels from the royal vaults, but she had refused it all. She would come to him as herself, as the woman he had finally learned to see. Cassian waited for her on the ceremonial dais, which had been moved from the throne's shadow to the center of the hall. He was a king in his full regalia, a silver circlet on his brow, but his eyes were only for the great doors. He was not looking at his subjects. He was looking for his mate. His heart hammered in his chest, a wild rhythm of fear and elation. He had spent the last year earning this moment, but the fear that she might change her mind, that he might still be unworthy, was a cold knot in his stomach. The doors swung open. A hush fell over the hall. Iris walked in, alone. She did not lean on her father's arm. She walked with her unique, uneven grace, her head held high, her eyes fixed on his. To Cassian, she was more radiant than any queen in history. She was not a flawless statue. She was a living, breathing masterpiece of resilience. She reached the dais and stood before him. The High Elder stepped forward to begin the ancient rite, but Iris held up a hand, stopping him. "I have a vow to make first," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent hall. She turned to Cassian, her dark eyes full of a love that stole his breath. "You learned my language," she said softly, for his ears only. "Now, I will speak it for you, for everyone." Before he could ask what she meant, she stepped into the center of the dais. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to dance. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was unheard of. A mating ceremony was a solemn rite, not a performance. But Cassian understood. This was not a performance. This was her testimony. This was her vow, written in the language of her body, her soul. The dance began with the memory of a fall, a child's pain, her movements small and broken. She danced the loneliness, the feeling of being other, of being flawed. Then the dance shifted. It became the story of the great hall, of a brief, brilliant spark of hope, her movements soaring and full of light. It was followed by the sharp, brutal agony of his rejection. She stumbled, her body collapsing inward, her limp exaggerated, a portrait of pure humiliation and grief. Cassian felt every movement like a blow to his own body. He stood unmoving, his kingly composure crumbling, as she forced him, and the entire world, to witness the pain he had caused. Tears began to stream down his face, hot and unashamed. He did not wipe them away. This was his penance, to watch her story, to feel the full weight of his sin. But the dance did not end in despair. Slowly, she rose. She danced the anger, the defiance, the long months of forging her pain into strength in a quiet clearing by a river. Her movements became powerful, graceful, her limp no longer a wound but the very heart of her strength. She danced the story of his silent vigil, of the letters, of being seen, of a slow, cautious thawing. Finally, she danced the journey to his garden, the terror and the hope, and the moment of forgiveness when she had touched his face. The dance ended with her standing before him, her arms open, her chest heaving, her face luminous. It was an offering, a declaration. "This is all of me," her body said, "the broken parts and the beautiful parts. I am whole. Do you still choose me?" The hall was utterly silent, the only sound the soft weeping of those who had been moved by her story. Cassian stepped forward, his own face wet with tears. He took her hands, his grip trembling. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in their golden depths a love so profound, so absolute, it healed the last of her scars. He turned to the crowd, his voice thick with emotion, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You all bore witness to my great shame," he began, his voice raw, "when I rejected the gift of the goddess out of pride and blindness. Now, bear witness to my salvation." He looked back down at Iris, his gaze full of worship. "I, Cassian Thorn, Alpha King of the United Packs, choose you, Iris Lockwood. I choose your strength and your scars. I choose your fire and your grace. I choose your past and our future. I see all of you," he choked out the words, "and all of you is my queen. All of you is my mate, my other half. Before all witnesses, before the goddess herself, I am yours, wholly and forever." He sealed his vow not with a king's proclamation, but with a gesture of pure devotion. He knelt before her, the king on his knees before his Omega mate. He took her left foot, the one that carried her limp, her warrior's mark, and he pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her instep. Iris gasped, tears finally spilling from her own eyes, as the entire hall erupted not just in applause, but in a collective howl of joy and acceptance, a sound that shook the very foundations of the palace. He rose, and cupping her face in his hands, he leaned in, and finally, after a year of longing, kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming, a quiet promise of a lifetime of sunrises, of moonlit dances, and of a love that had been broken and reforged into something unbreakable.